Welcome to Lesson 4. We're going to talk about everybody's favorite food group, fibrous vegetables, and then also starch foods. That was kind of kidding. All right. So the first group we'll talk about is the fibrous/non-starchy vegetable group. And as I said facetiously, this is everybody's favorite food group when, in my observations and in my experience, it tends to be everyone's least favorite food group. So we got to explain a little bit of classification differences between me and the USDA. So here's where the USDA food group classification system and I diverge. And so in the USDA system, they group together all the vegetables, including the starchy vegetables as well as the non-starchy vegetables. And so what I would rather do, I would rather put fibrous/non-starchy vegetables into their own group. And we're talking about vegetables that typically make it into a salad. So the leafy greens, the other colors that are just basically wisps of air and water and micronutrition and fiber. Whereas foods like pulses or beans, peas, and lentils, and tubers like potatoes and yams, those things really should be going into the starchy foods group. So although botanically they may all be vegetables, I don't like to treat them as being equivalent as far as nutritional food groups go. Okay, so I would rather classify foods nutritionally than botanically in this case. All right, so fibrous vegetables, as I mentioned, they warrant their own category since they uniquely provide essential and beneficial nutrition, including phytonutrients and fiber, in a very low calorie and high volume matrix. So, in other words, there are very few calories per unit of mass with the fibrous vegetable group. And there's a lot of nutrition per calorie. The fibrous vegetable group consists of leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables of all types and colors. So we have the dark greens, the reds, oranges, yellows, and others. Some examples of the fibrous non-starchy vegetables are all lettuces, all peppers, artichoke, arugula, asparagus, bok choy, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, celery, collards, cucumber, dandelion, green beans, kale, leeks, mushrooms, mustard, onion, all types of onions, radish, spinach, sprouts, string beans, tomatoes, and zucchini, to name a few. So these fibrous vegetables are important sources of many nutrients, including dietary fiber, potassium, carotenoids, vitamin C, K, E, B6, folate, copper, magnesium, manganese, thiamine, niacin, and choline. Each of the vegetable subgroups, talking about the colors, the dark greens, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, the beiges, they contribute different combination of nutrients. And so this makes it important for individuals to consume a variety of these vegetables, just to kind of hit the variety principle. And to reiterate, the reason you would get or strive to get a variety of foods within each food group is because each food species has its own unique nutritional profile and thus its own unique benefits it can offer for long-term health. So you wouldn't just want to eat broccoli if you wanted to include vegetables in the diet. A reasonable target and this applies to all the food groups, try to get at least 3 different types of vegetables across the course of the week. Okay, if not the course of, yeah, it's a little bit tough to get it across the course of the day, but at least across the course of the week, try to get at least three different types of fibrous slash non-starchy vegetables into the diet. And this principle applies to all the food groups. All right, let's look at the starch group. Starch group is a little bit complex because it has three subgroups. So the USDA food group classification, once again, it diverges from my classification by lumping in starchy vegetables like pulses and tubers into a single vegetable group. So while this isn't botanically incorrect, starch, which technically is it refers to, in biochemical terms, polysaccharides. So starches are complex carbohydrates, long chains of glucose units, sometimes branched, sometimes not. So that is their predominant nutrient, starch I'm talking about. And it is the nutrient within the starch group that has the most energetic and metabolic impact. And that includes starches within starchy vegetables like potatoes. So that's why they are grouped within the starch group and not within the vegetable group, even though potatoes and beans and peas and yams and other roots are, even though they're technically vegetables, I put them in the starch group because they're predominantly made of starch. The starch group encompasses three subcategories. So it encompasses grains, and examples of grains are amaranth, barley, corn, oats, rice, sorghum, teff, and wheat. And it also encompasses tubers and roots. And that examples of tubers are potatoes, yams, cassava. And the third subgroup of the starch group are pulses, better known as legumes, even though, as I've mentioned earlier, legumes are in reference to the family Solanaceae, and that includes the leaves and the pods and the stems of the plant. And pulses are specifically the beans, peas, and lentils aspect of it. So that is the third subgroup of the starch group. So with starch, we've got grains, we got tubers, and we've got pulses. That is the starch group. So the starch group is an important source of a multitude of nutrients, as you can imagine, since it has three subgroups of foods in there. And aside from the energy or calories it provides in the form of complex carbohydrates, we'll go through each of the subgroups and what they provide in general. So grains are generally a good source of fiber, folate, carotenoids, magnesium, B vitamins, and phosphorus. Tubers, which once again are your potatoes, yams, those are significant sources of fiber, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, vitamin C, and phenolic compounds. Pulses, which include your beans, peas, and lentils, those are rich in fiber. They're also rich in protein, folate, iron, calcium, magnesium, zinc, and potassium. And I want to take a couple steps back and mention that grains are often fortified with essential nutrients that are underconsumed at the population level. So the starch group, when you look at these three subcategories, we're not just talking about a bunch of flour foods here, refined flour foods and stuff. We're talking about actual whole intact foods for the most part, until we look at grains where there's this sort of double-edged sword dichotomy, which I'll get into. So let's talk about grains. So whole grain products, in quotes, whole grain products are required to contain 30 to 50% whole grain ingredients. So if a product is labeled whole grain, then it can have 50 to 70% of it still being refined flour type product. In the US, the requirement for whole grain foods is that the whole the whole grain aspect of the food must be the first ingredient. But still, that leaves any number of permutations of ingredients that follow it that are not necessarily conducive to long term health. So just because a food is labeled as whole grain doesn't mean it's a healthy food. And furthermore, for the goal of weight slash fat loss, grain products, as opposed to whole grains themselves, such as oats, for example. Oats are kind of the MVP of grains because their research track record is almost perfect. But back to the point, for the goal of weight loss and fat loss, grain products and flour based foods and snacks, regardless of their whole grain status, can be a double edged sword due to their energy density, their palatability, and their potential to displace more satiating foods. And I'm referring specifically to other foods in the diet that have better capacity to control hunger and cravings, and frankly, to provide essential nutrition as well. And so, yes, that is a mouthful. That is the starch group. And with that, I will see you back on lesson 5, where we talk about milk and milk products and fruit.